I came to Fulbourn Mental Hospital at the age of 32, some 43 years ago. I'd been a soldier and seen many horrid things in war. I'd had a long training as a psychiatrist. This was my first senior post, and I was determined to try and achieve something in it.
In 1953, David Clark became the youngest medical superintendent in the country. Fulbourn Asylum near Cambridge was run with the precision of a military operation.
The medical superintendent of the hospital had tremendous power and responsibility. There were 200-300 staff in these ancient Victorian buildings. There was a shoemaker to mend the men's boots. There was a baker who baked the hospital's bread. There was a mattress maker. There were all sorts of people just maintaining this self-contained institution.
But behind the well-kept facade, David Clark discovered misery and degradation. There were 1,000 patients, 90 to a ward, and like all hospitals of the time, strictly segregated by sex. Dr. Clark found forgotten people, certified in their youth, and never likely to get out. Many patients were locked up 24 hours a day.
Oh, they were prisoners. There's no question about that. They wore hospital clothing, which was taken off them at night. They were not allowed to have any money or really personal possessions either. Some of the women had to wear what were called locked boots, which were boots that were locked by the staff so that they couldn't take them off and throw them at people.
The wards could erupt at any time.
Mentally disordered people may be violent, even homicidal. They hear voices. They may believe that they're being persecuted and strike back with fury.
One of them got out of bed. I walked towards him a couple of steps and he hit me full on the chin. Had I known what I know now, I'd have left him there. But as it was, I walked over to him, leaned over him and said, "What did you do that for?" And he jumped up, got hold of my tie, the short bit, pulled it, and it cut my hair off. By pure fluke, a member of staff happened to come in and he got this person's fingers off of my tie, and I think he saved my life.
Clark believed that locking people up not only inflamed the patients, it brutalized the staff. The corridors of Fulbourn contained horrifying echoes of scenes he'd witnessed in Germany in 1945 as a young army doctor.
I had seen the brutalities that men could inflict on others. I knew that there were people in our army who could have run concentration camps if they'd been ordered to. And I knew that what was wrong with the asylums was that they were applying a military model to an institution where it was not appropriate. It was brought home to me vividly. The first hospital that I worked in, I had one of my patients killed by the nurses. He attacked them, they beat him up, and they beat him up too hard, and he died. Get off me! It doesn't have to be like that. It shouldn't be right in the 1950s that people lived such utterly degraded lives under a system of such brutality merely because they were mentally disordered.
David turned this average county mental hospital from a pauper lunatic asylum into one of the leading psychiatric centres in the world.
Was, yes. It was fun. It was exciting.
David would come back from holiday and with great enthusiasm would say, I think there's something that you'll probably want to try.
A spirit of freedom, a spirit of exploring, a spirit of saying, hey, let's give it a go. Why not? Let's try it. Let's see what happens. Let's open this up a little bit and see what response we can get from the people here.
I was operating in the early years of the National Health Service, which was a wonderful and revolutionary time. They realised how appallingly impoverished asylums were, and they were pouring money into them. But not only that, there was backing for people who were prepared to make experiments.
In those early days, his two most formidable allies were the matron and her deputy. Desperate to improve the wards themselves, they were delighted to have David Clark on their side.
He was very young, yes.
Yes, he was very young.
Yes, I had to bear that in mind, but he was a very hard-working person. And I could speak quite frankly to him, and he understood what I meant.
She felt passionate and angry and determined to change things and furious with everybody.
I wanted to do an awful lot, and I'd only just been matron for a year, and he was a godsend to me. I was in charge of the laundry, and I went to the laundry superintendent, Miss Quinney, and I said, we must do something about this clothing with the patients. The corsets were blue...
Blue corsets.
Blue corsets. I'd never seen anything like it in my life before, done up, you know.
The older people
And,
used to wear them.
You know, and tie-on petticoats round the waist, you see. I disliked it very much. How would you like to put on somebody else's underclothes
Oh,
from
they
the
were
pack?
very
How would you
tickled.
like it? No, I wouldn't
Especially-
like that at all if anybody asked me to put
especially,
on somebody else's clothes. That was the first thing I did, and they had all their own underclothes. And then we got these comfortable beds. They had individual lockers. The patients worked, and they had their money paid out to them every week. And they could spend it at Jerry Hinton or at the hospital shop. And if there's anything wrong, well, I put it right.
But the patients were still unpredictable and angry.
Broken windows are often an indicator of levels of tension in the wards.
On one particular ward, where our patients were rather disturbed, we would perhaps have, well, a window broken nearly every day, wouldn't we, Miss Legg?
Yes, occasionally, yes, we did.
Really?
Not always.
But
Really.
I can understand the building up of the tension, you see, of the patients. Because it would happen to anybody.
Well, they...
To be locked in a ward and couldn't get out.
Clark had heard of an experiment in Scotland where the doors on the wards had been unlocked. He wanted to open up Fulbourn, to let the patients socialise with each other and wander freely in and out of the grounds.
I knew that many patients could handle much more freedom. Of course, a number of the staff were very doubtful.
I think staff were afraid that had they lost control, lost the system, lost the discipline, then they wouldn't be able to manage the institution.
The idea of opening up the doors was really quite revolutionary.
And so it was a total shift of culture. The old ones thinking, we're not used to this. The younger ones coming in and thinking again, yeah, maybe so, this will work. Let's try it.
They were very enthusiastic too, the sisters. They used to come to the office and says, I've opened my ward today. And then another woman said, oh, mine's going to open tomorrow. The last one to open was the ward where we had the most disturbed patients. But we managed to open it in the end. It was open. Dr. Clark was very keen that they were all open.
The opening of the doors was one of the most exciting things that I ever did at Fulbourn.
They would wander out occasionally.
Oh, they wandered off.
Oh, yes, very often. We'd have as many perhaps as 2 or 3 people wandering in a day, wouldn't we? And then when they came back again, you see, we would put them to bed, take their clothes away for a few days until they settled.
I mean, first of all, it made the life of the patients a great deal better.
If you open up an institution, then the amount of internal tension goes down, and so the potential for violence goes down as well.
Patients felt different because they could walk out.
And they could say what they wanted, what they liked, what they didn't like, how things should go.
But for the staff, the important thing was that they found that instead of being jailers and oppressors of the patients, they were seen as their friends. This was a radical and almost magical change.
But some parts of Fulbourn hadn't changed. The treatments were still crude and often violent. Schizophrenic patients were put into a deep and life-threatening coma with huge doses of insulin. The hope was that their minds would be forced to relax. Each patient had at least 5 treatments a week for 6 weeks. It didn't work. Electric shock treatment was also used regularly to alleviate depression, often successfully, although it terrified the patients. In the basement operating theatre, the treatment of last resort was radical brain surgery. In 1960, a new psychiatrist joined the medical team at Fulbourn. He had been working at a laboratory in Switzerland, developing chemical treatments for mental illness.
Suddenly, I appeared bearing gifts of drugs, and David was very willing to allow me to go ahead with these. He said, I want to learn about them.
The drug Largactil was the first successful treatment for schizophrenia. It was quickly followed by an antidepressant. These new drugs and their successors transformed psychiatry.
The tranquilizers did an awful lot for the mental patients, there's no doubt about that. But you had to be careful with Largactil because you could give too much.
Modern drugs like Largactil made a tremendous difference.
The violence, the aggression was beginning to diminish.
Which I think helped Dr. Clark in his bid to open up the hospital.
The drugs also allowed David Clark to embark on his second great psychiatric revolution.
And it's at this time that the idea of a halfway house was floated, and we started one in 1958, Winston House, which was one of the first in England and became remarkably well known. It was the beginning of the whole process of community care. We gradually worked out what was needed to rehabilitate people crippled by chronic mental illness. It was a long process of trial and error.
Patients may have already been in hospital a long time, or certainly had in those days, and they had become institutionalized. They were totally dependent upon the hospital around them. They made no decisions for themselves. They simply couldn't fend for themselves in the outside world.
You had to restructure the whole way of life of the hospital and see the hospital as an educational place, as a place in which people could learn to live differently. And I said to the staff working with them, look, I'd like to try and develop self-government in these wards.
Self-government was to become David Clark's obsession and his major contribution. His first therapeutic community, as it was called, was led by one of the hospital's young nurses.
Ruby Mungovan became the leader of Hereward House and did a brilliant job there, and before she left the hospital was lecturing internationally.
We had meetings every day. That's what you do when you're in a therapeutic community. You have face-to-face confrontation. You discuss all the things that need discussing. You find a solution if it's possible, and help people through the meetings.
How do you think we should help you start?
Well, first of all, by telling me that I'm not trying to go there.
The therapeutic community was a way of restructuring a psychiatric ward.
It wasn't all, intelligent talk stuff. Sometimes it was throwing things, and sometimes it was shouting, sometimes it was swearing, sometimes it was fighting even.
You don't want to speak up for me and say that I've tried harder than Laurel, but I'll soon do it.
Well, you're back with us now, and you'll settle down a bit.
No, Debbie. No, Debbie! You'll get one. No, I don't. Because I want my legs. Would you like that?
No, fair enough, but you don't have to go and have a go at her in the way that you did.
Well, she gets something back and she does that. I told her that
should
before.
she, for God's sake? There's other ways of doing
It gave them confidence. It gave them the ability to make yet another stride. And of course, there was Dr. Clark, powerful, strong, supportive, but never saying, this is the way you do it. Everybody had their own contribution to make.
Because we were seeing, how often were we seeing Joy at that time then? Once
Every
a week?
week, yeah.
Almost try and keep steady, mustn't we?
Yeah.
It was very exciting.
By the time Miss Brock retired, the staff were treading a tightrope between freedom and total chaos.
People in other areas were watching carefully to see if this would work.
Well, some of the older members of staff used to say, I don't know what this place is coming to. The patients are telling people what to do.
Unmade beds, cups, cigarette ends, you name it. It was all over the place.
Yeah, people wouldn't take their cups back to the kitchen. And
windows were going at a rate of...
it was stupid, wasn't it?
Pains a day,
People were just doing it for the sake of doing it.
And then the meeting decided that the people should be punished. And the sum, I remember the sum was 10 shillings. And that was what had to be paid.
You could have a good 10 shillings worth something. Yeah.
Relatives weren't allowed to pay. And
Perhaps
then we had a graph and showed how they came down from something like £100 a week to 3 or 4.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did.
The therapeutic community makes individuals apply self-discipline to themselves of a type that you couldn't possibly impose by the most authoritarian management.
I was there about four or 5 years.
Longer than that, I think, Margaret.
Was it? Being anxious and depressed and frightened and angry. I remember saying to my mother once, it's not you I hate, but I do hate myself. Because I went to look after David, your David.
Yes. My younger son. You did.
And I really wasn't feeling very well.
I remember somebody said to me, you better put all the knives out of the way if she's going over there to your house. I remember because you had cut your wrist.
Yes,
and she'd gone over to babysit with bandages round the cuts on her scooter, and people thought I was crazy. And I just didn't see that it was wrong to trust her at that time. And you never let me down, did you? Never.
No.
But it could have been awful.
If you could trust people and create an environment where people had the chance to grow, they would. I mean, the most withdrawn patient, the most obdurate and argumentative member of staff, the most willful registrar would grow and develop if you gave them trust and opportunity to do so.
And then we almost ran the meetings ourselves in the end, didn't we?
You were chairman on some occasions,
no, I wasn't.
or
I was
treasurer, secretary or something.
People who hadn't worked within this environment couldn't really begin to understand it until they'd worked within the environment, and that it was breaking new ground.
The idea was to allow people who are normally at the bottom of the authority pyramid to have a very real say in the pattern of everyday life.
We went to Paris after that, didn't we?
Yeah.
Got drunk, didn't we?
One of the myths would be, for example, that patients would prescribe treatment for one another.
Quite a lot of people handed over to me a tin full of Largactil tablets that they'd been saving up for months. Other people told of regularly putting their medication down the lavatory. And I thought it was much better to bring this out into the open. And I can remember occasions when people said to me, you know, you're giving John too much Largactil. If you try giving him half that amount, he'll do much better. And we did. Sometimes they were wrong, sometimes they were right. But people leaving Heroin House had a much better idea of what they were taking and why, and what would happen if they stopped it.
Well, they wanted me to live on my own, and I really didn't think I could do that, and I really didn't want to live. I took an overdose. I could not see how I could ever cope with a life like that. And I met Don in hospital, yes. We were married in 1973, and I still had to go back occasionally to Kent House, and then Sarah was born, and I never went back again, ever.
Margaret was the sort of person who would have received the worst of the old system. She would have no possibility of rehabilitation, of normal social life, and certainly would never have met any male patients. And one can only be glad that there are no longer hundreds of people doomed or sentenced to decades of life in the hospital.
But the demands on the staff were immense.
Quite a lot of doctors found it stressful and difficult and wanted to retreat back to sitting behind a desk and prescribing pills.
And when he introduced social therapy to the acute wards, full of psychotic patients from casualty, the opposition from staff increased.
It didn't help everyone. There were always the few patients who were perhaps too damaged.
There's no point in pushing levels of responsibility onto somebody before they're actually ready to take it.
Social therapy had a lot of enemies who've criticised David Clarke for ignoring research into the biology of psychiatric illness.
I didn't think it was helpful for patients. I thought it was a chaotic regime and wasn't focused enough on the medical treatments necessary for mental illness.
So in 1976, when the authorities appointed a new professor of psychiatry, they chose a more scientific psychiatrist, Sir Martin Roth.
The ward that I found myself working in was still having these regular community meetings each day, and it took some time for us to make an impression on this, to get this slowly deleted.
David's ideas arose out of the social and the psychological model, looking at behavior of people in groups, whereas Sir Martin's great strength was his incredible encyclopedic knowledge of medicine, of looking at mental illness in its biological element.
Whereas a community was supposed to be engaged in the main tasks of evaluation and treatment, I regard psychiatric examination and treatment as an individual matter, as a task which is undertaken by a professionally trained individual, of course in consultation with others.
This very rapidly disrupted the therapeutic atmosphere in the wards, and many of them became sour, squabbling places, and as a result the patients did badly. And then there was trouble, and then there were inquiries and demands for more restrictions and so on.
In 1983, after 30 years of service, David Clarke retired. Cambridge psychiatry moved from his dream of social therapy to treatment by doctors of individuals on a one-to-one basis. 2 years later, Sir Martin Roth also retired from Fulbourn. By that time, the institution itself was under threat. A new national emphasis on fast turnaround of patients satisfied neither Clark nor Roth. Most of the hospital is now for sale. There were 1,000 beds. Now there are only 280.
Oh, it looks dreadful. Such a waste.
There aren't any beds to admit patients some weekends, or that wards run at 140% occupancy.
Most of the people I looked after are, of course, living out in the community. At any one time, there'll be a few back in hospital. Hello, Iris.
Hello. Nice to see you again.
And you, my dear.
Do you know Jeff Lloyd?
No, I don't. Who's he?
He's a multi-millionaire.
Oh, no, I don't know any multimillionaires. No. You remember you had a bit of trouble in Cherry Hinton when I was looking after you? You got into trouble with the police? No. You've forgotten all about that? Yeah.
In one sense, things at Fulbourn have come full circle.
It is a locked ward. We opened in January of last year. It's for severely ill patients. They may be hearing voices, they may be having very strange ideas about themselves and other people. I think doctors and nurses are very aware of the perception from the public that more and more violence is being committed by mentally ill patients. I don't know if that's actually true, but there's certainly a perception, and we feel more of a burden of responsibility than we used to. And I think sometimes that emphasis comes away from the previous emphasis, which is about make the right diagnosis, give the right treatment, get the patient as well as you can.
I've come to the conclusion that a society tends to get the sort of psychiatry that it deserves. We've seen this in our own lifetimes. In the 50s, we had our society set up a welfare state and wanted to care for the unfortunate. Towards the end of my time, I failed to help doctors to learn about the importance of social therapy. We wrote about it and we tried to describe it, and I believe it will be available there for later generations when they have to go back to it, because they will have to go back to it, whatever they're doing at the present time.
Next Monday, the pioneering paediatrician who saved the lives of 15,000 babies in a career spanning 5 decades. That's at the earlier time of 9 o'clock.